We come to the 14th presentation of the Parayana, and we're now going to go deeper and higher at the same time, so that the parentheses of expression will expand, and we will be able to pivot. And what we're pivoting on is my presentation for some years now of the way in which to recalibrate civilization by providing time forms that are able to be understood both strategically and tactically. And we're beginning to appreciate that it takes a while to layer, or a good English word I used to use all the time is lave. Lave is to lick into shape like an ice cream cone. To lave a field of materia into the delight, the taste, the appreciation, but also into the shaping so that one can continue to do this. And it is this laving, layering that is characteristic of differential consciousness. And that differential consciousness is a complementarity with the integral cycle, the way in which time as a first dimension dynamic introduces a universe where sequence is important, where the rhythm of sequence is significant, and the significance and the importance of time as the metronome of nature allows then for spontaneous time to instantly blossom space, so that the three dimensions, the trinity of dimensions of space, blossom instantly from time, but time occurs out of a zero field spontaneously, which to high Dharma wisdom has for several millennia implied and meant and signified that zero is fertile. That zero most certainly is not a point. There is no 0 point, there's no zero horizon, there is a zero field, and that this zero field is fertile. And the fertility of zero field, nature, makes nature a mother. Not just feminine, but a mother. So that Mother Nature is a very accurate way to speak, not just colloquially, not just mythically, but deeply in significantly expressive terms. That she is fertile in her field of emptiness, that her seeming nothingness is fertile, is a mystery. But a mystery which one can understand, that she was fertilized, that her receptivity had received a creativity. And so this creative and receptive are really like the most primordial way, for instance, that the Chinese 5,000 years ago with Fuxi and Du Gua, they were architects 5,000 years ago in ancient pre-dynastic China. The icon of Fuxi is always that he has the carpenter's square. The L shape with the cross at the angles is a carpenter's square. He can build. And Nu Gua, his mate, his tuned pair, she holds a plumb bob. And that with her plumb bob and his carpenter's square, the entire symbolic structure of the I Ching can be made that has a deep, truthful correlation with the nature of the universe, and that in that nature there are eventually that pair becomes paired, and that pair of pairs has its own pairing, and so one comes to a 2-cube, 8-fold, 8-form structure. And that is what I have developed over the last 50 years as a way of learning. The quality of time forms is that the rhythm follows a rhythm of increased energy, of increased frequency. And one of the current, in the last several decades, about a third of a century really if you go into it historically in a kaleidoscopic conscious way, the way in which a time, energy, and nature, which is consistently a dimension, the first dimension, when it becomes energized, the frequency increases, and when it increases, the registry, in terms of a mathematical graphic registry, like a sine wave of the energy frequency, becomes increasingly active and also becomes complex. So that in nature, while there is one time, one dimension of time, by the time it gets to our quality of beings having a civilization, there are really 3 time forms operative at the same time as the first dimension, and that this operativeness introduces further dimensions. That space-time, to use a colloquial phrase made popular since 1905 by Einstein, space-time gives birth to, is fertile because of it being truthfully Mother Nature's entire cycle. She is pregnant again. She has been fertilized again, and she has received again, and the creativity and the receptivity have created again a new generation. And that this new generation then are endowed with, are given this heritage of not only the developments of the whole natural integral, but whatever has accumulated as the differential consciousness. And that in civilization, that differential consciousness has further expanded and refined and developed into a kaleidoscopic consciousness, which we can, in terms of learning, in terms of an 8-phase learning, double cycle, integral and differential, call history, which is an expansion of vision. And so the whole visionary field opens, not like a Pandora's box, but opens, as it were, in a way that Isis initiates in a mythic horizon, deepening into a mystery, religious ability to have something which is a rebirth. Not just a rebirthing, not just being pregnant again in one's own inheritance from Mother Nature, but one has received not only the mother's nature of being fertile, one has received a, quote, father times quality of being creatively able to join that fertility. And so this whole image eternal of a family of man is quite real, actually. But it is not just a family of man, but a family of all sentient beings. Because the first indication that all of this is possible, indeed, joyously parades itself forth, is that emotion is able to refine itself through experience into feeling. And it is feeling tones that bring out of the materia of perception and engender the further refinement of perception into images. And that these images love the feeling tones, and they kind of flow together. And as they flow together in this integral cycle, they engender the ability to have, in the symbolic structure of what is quickly now becoming the mind, they become the imagination. And the imagination, if it can remember either the images in some pattern or in some sequence, or on the other hand, which the two go together, if one can recontact the feeling tone, the remembrance of the images in their pattern, not just individually, but in their pattern, in their sequence, in their flowingness. But essentially, it's the pattern that first initially comes forth, and this is the way in which art becomes remembered and emerged, and not only born, but the artist is someone who is reborn out of the fertility of Mother Nature's DNA and Father times DNA, and that these together have endowed the artists with a generational quality of not just being individual, but of becoming personal. And so the artist is personal. And that person is like a sixth dimension that has stepped forth out of a four-dimensional universe into the beginnings of a multi-dimensional cosmos. It is the quality of the artist to be able to know that they live in terms of Mother Nature's field, but they love in terms of Father and Mother Nature's cooperative pairing synergy. And it is in the time forms of civilization that this is accentuated. It's accentuated not only because art now, as a sixth dimension, emerging almost instantly out of the spontaneous vision, which is a fifth dimension, a magical fifth dimension. And everyone used to talk about in show business, I mean theater business, plays, that there is a fifth business, which is the magic of the performance. This evening is a grand night for singing. The stars are shining above, and I think I'm falling in love. It's the ancient way in which a May Day dance in Elizabethan Shakespearean English would be expressed. And anyone like myself who as a child once danced around a maypole with other children in the conclusion of a great May Day celebration in the 1940s for me, will remember all of the men and women, boys and girls, at the conclusion in long lines with arms around each other singing that joyous choral that art has emerged quintessentially to bring magic into life and love so that reality occurs in a presence. It is that presence that is shareable, that the Greek word for it in terms of a person was epiphany, that one would have an epiphany, made popular in the grand literature of the earlier part of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, by James Joyce, in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. The way in which Stephen Dedalus laves and layers his way into maturity, he comes to realize that he is an artist, not just a young man. And that this artist now has the ability to recognize and the great artificer of it all, and pays homage and praise with a thank you. Thank you, which is actually a thanksgiving. And that thanksgiving is a hallmark in the way in which civilization on this planet, in this world, in this star system, came very quickly to an energetic boil and a maturity which was startling, absolutely startling. One of the great literary achievements about 175 to about 170 BC. A series of, we have recovered 25 of the Thanksgiving hymns. In ancient Hebrew, the term is hodiot, and the hodiot are the Thanksgiving hymns of the teacher of righteousness, who was the founder of the Qumran community and the founder of the council that act as the guiding persons of the community, and that the head of the guiding community is called the guide. In ancient Hebrew, Mekecher. Mekecher is the guardian of the community through the council that allows for the purity of the presence, the presencing, to come into play creatively because of being able to understand the time forms and to know what time it is. To know what time it is on the planet, in this world, now, and how we got there by the time, not just by its sequencing, but by its ordinality, complexifying, and that this cardinality and ordinality become something so powerful that geometry joyously curves itself into trigonometry. And in this trigonometric functioning, one is able to understand, one is able to see, to behold a participation in the visionary. And that participation doesn't remove one from nature, but one makes one many, so that one has all kinds of facets that begin to cut, and the individual who was there in that symbolic structure, courtesy of the materiality of the world, of the way in which the physics and the chemistry and the biology, etc., actually do their little do-si-do contacting, flames deeper than patterns, becomes more than just rhythms, but is heard as music, seen as dance, kinesthetically entering into the way in which life and love participate in what Virginia Woolf once, in flashes of insight, wrote that these are moments of eternity. It is a quality of the teacher of righteousness to be one of the most significant forerunners possible, because he occupied in a brilliant way a threshold between what we understand, have come to understand, by the 14th presentation and by presentations from other series, all the way back to paired phase transforms. That one of the most powerful operative sine wave energies of time in civilization, one of three, is a reference wave. And that reference wave are men and women at that cusp, at that node, at that creative, memorable, fertile, able to engender more life, more love, indeed, without end. That reference wave is going to be the reference wave when it is fulfilled 350 years later as a carrier wave. And that carrier wave is like in the course of a giant time tsunami in civilization. The reference wave is the beginning of that sequencing, of that pattern, that it's coming. And there isn't anything, not only that empires can't do about it, but there isn't anything that the whole integral order can do to stop it. Even if you had the hubris of Captain Ahab telling Starbuck in his arrogance, "Man, I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." Reported by the lone survivor, Ishmael. It is a quality that the reference wave leading up to the carrier wave has a midpoint. And as the reference wave of that particular whole aeon is the best ancient word, Greek word, to call it. And as the aeon has a midpoint called a millennium, the aeon being 2,000 years, 2 millennia, with a midpoint of a millennium, the midpoint between the reference wave and the carrier wave is also a midpoint. And the reference wave for that particular aeon was 350 BC. About the time of the closing of Plato's life, the ending of 20 years of Aristotle's learning under Plato, the development of this entire inheritance all the way back to Pythagoras, and the birth of Alexander the Great coming up. And so Alexander the Great is a good metronome to keep. At the same time, 350 BC is the birth date, roughly, of Vyasa, who is the great poet of that age in India, who by the time he was about 50 years old, about 300 BC, wrote the classic basic Mahabharata in 18 sections, 18 parvans, and 1/3 of the way through, in the 6th parvan, is where the Bhagavad Gita occurs. And so the author of the whole development of Alexandria and the author of the whole development of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita all occur at that reference wave, and the midpoint is to a carrier wave that struck in its gorgeous dynamic of time, pushing aside the whole corrupt detritus of the past, about 9 BC. The midpoint was 175 BC. And in 175 BC, one finds the founding of the Qumran community, and the Qumran community under the Qumran Council. And the founder of that, the midpoint between the reference wave and the carrier wave, was the teacher of righteousness. And that teacher of righteousness was contacted because he was sent by a vision which he had had, where he grew up, where he was masterful, where he was quite well known, very, very famous. And in his vision, he understood that the colossal events that were happening in that region that was always in between Egypt and Mesopotamia and the East Mediterranean area was the big city at that time in classical development was Damascus. And so the teacher of righteousness went from Alexandria to Damascus about 176 BC and was discovered by a questing community of Jews who were astounded that the whole promised land again had gone into convolutions, forcing them into another exile. This was not the exile to Babylon. This was the second exile to Damascus, where they were trying to put together, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it reads that they wandered for 20 years like blind men. They didn't know what to do, or where to do, or how to do. And it says immediately in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the community scroll, God had raised up a teacher of righteousness who understood in his heart God's presence. And the teacher of righteousness brought them to the site of Qumran in the wilderness of Judea on the shores of the Dead Sea, up above it, several hundred feet, and established the way in which the community rule, the way in which the council patterning would operate. And of course, this was like pulling the plug on an energized empire an empire that had inherited the Seleucid dynasty. Seleucus Nicator was one of the great generals of Alexander the Great. And it was his descendants then that became the kings of the Seleucid Empire. And by 175 BC, a new, young inheritor of the Seleucid Empire, his name was Antiochus IV. And Antiochus is named because that powerful dynasty was establishing the great city of Antioch. Antiochus. It is the Persian Empire become now an Alexander the Great, Iranian Persian Empire, and immediately Antiochus IV drew a bead on another city that was a stone in the craw of the power of that group, and that was Jerusalem, and rushed personally with immense force and took over Jerusalem, took over Judea, took over the whole Promised Land area, and in fact was pushing to get into Egypt and take them over too, but was stopped by the Egyptian. Why? Because another general of Alexander the Great, Ptolemy, had established his own empire at the same time that Seleucus Nicator was establishing his, and others were establishing theirs. All the generals divided it up. Like Pancho Villa taking the north, and Emiliano Zapata taking the south, and let's have a different Mexico. Jeez, let's get drunk and talk about it. And Villa saying, no, you're going to be the president. I'm done with it. I'm going to a cattle ranch where I can drink in peace. And Zapata tried to be the new emperor of Mexico and found it's not a place that you can be good in. The stuck integrals will sabotage you all the time, will plot all the time, will corrupt all the time. It's what they do. And the teacher of righteousness in his Thanksgiving hymns says there are two spirits. There's a spirit of deceit, an evil spirit of deceit, and there is a spirit of truth. And they are constantly in enmity because the one is a negation of the other. It's not a negation into nothingness at all. It's a negation into a corruptiveness, a deceitfulness. And the ancient name for that in Hebrew was Belial, the liar. Antiochus IV took over the temple, the second temple in Jerusalem, and he made it into a temple of Zeus. And he made it punishable by death if anyone tried to worship Yahweh in his own house in Jerusalem, in the temple. And it was at that time that the Qumran community and the Qumran council came into being because of the teacher of righteousness, who carried with him at that time the most authority in terms of the kaleidoscopic heritage of Judaism, of the Hebrew language tradition, of the Hebrew-Greek language traditions that had come together in Alexandria under Ptolemy, under his dynasty that was much more powerful in many ways and almost always than the Seleucid dynasty. And so the star Jew of Alexandria went back through Damascus to Qumran, establishing below the confiscated temple up on the high ridge in Jerusalem to set in motion, because he understood time forms as well as anyone has ever understood them. And that entire community and council lasted until 31 BC, when a massive earthquake hit exactly center. Must have been an 8 or 9 point earthquake. And it crumbled the buildings of Qumran and sent a split in the land down the stairwell, outside stairwell, into the pool of cleansing, into the pool of baptism, and drained the pool and split and into the community. It was in 31 BC that a Hebrew man, a Jewish man named Jesse, had a son born to him, named him Joseph, and Joseph would be the father of Jesus. It was in 31 BC that Augustus Caesar decimated at the Battle of Actium the military force of Antony and the imperial conniving patterns of Cleopatra, and founded, for all intents and purposes, the Roman Empire in himself. We're going to come back after a break and see that the inheritor of the teacher of righteousness, after that break of that earthquake, was a young baby that was secreted into the wilderness by his mother Elizabeth to save him from the death threats of King Herod, slaying all those under 2 years old that were born about that time, because the prophecies were saying that someone to replace him, his whole dynasty, had been born. That young baby was John the Baptist, who brought the whole teacher of righteousness time form back into play just in time to recognize the carrier wave has arrived. Let's take a break.